So let's talk about one specific type of political crimes that can be considered political crimes against the government. And what we're talking about here really kind of kind of eclipses political crimes in general. Terrorism you can kind of think of as kind of its own separate category that we should talk about a little bit differently from political crimes because what can and cannot be called terrorism, not all terrorism is political. Um, if it's done generally to incite fear in a community for political purposes, that could be political terrorism, but not all groups who have engaged in what we would call acts of terrorism necessarily have a political agenda behind them. So think about it for yourself for a few minutes. You all can probably think of some examples of things that you would call terrorism, but using your own criteria in your own head, what does something have to involve for you to differentiate it and call it terrorism as opposed to political crime, crime committed by an organized criminal group? Really think about what this is and how we're going to categorize and differentiate this from other types of crime we've learned about in this third section of the course. So there's a lot of different definitions to think about here. Not everybody necessarily defines it the same way, but there's some kind of agreed upon commonalities amongst people's definitions of terrorism. First of all, one of the big things that has to be in place for you to engage in an act of terrorism is the unlawful use of force. Obviously, it has to be an act that is in some way forcefully exerting either your um, opinion or exerting yourself in a physically violent manner. And this second one here, which is what causes a whole lot of acts to be put into this group that maybe you wouldn't initially think of, is you can call something a terrorist incident, an example of terrorism, if it's the intention of coercion or intimidation for political or some other ideological purposes. So, the intent, what makes something a terrorist act, also has a lot to do with the motivation behind it, the intent behind it. And if the intent is to intimidate people, to scare people, to force people to do things the way that you want to or face violent consequences, you can think of that as an act of terrorism, especially if the reasons that the terrorist organization or person talks about as motivation have some kind of a greater purpose, some kind of an ideological, political idea. Essentially, a couple other things that get into it has to be some kind of planned out, premeditated violence against usually non combatants. I mean, this is how we separate between, acts in war and acts otherwise. If you're an organization in one country who is at war with another country and you engage in a battle, in a violent outburst, amongst other people fighting in the war, that's not necessarily terrorism. It's when you plan out and enact violence against non-combatants, against the normal general public, against government workers, things like that. And there's a lot of different examples of ways that this can happen. You guys can obviously think of some very violent examples of terrorist incidents, sometimes involving bombings, shootings, assassinations, kidnapping of people, all of those different types of things you could call terrorist incidents because their purpose is to incite terror for some kind of a political, ideological, or otherwise purpose. So back in the 70s, a criminologist named Lacaire wrote about some terrorism myths that, according to him, people had been kind of picturing terrorists and terrorist incidents um, as needing to personify. And I think you'll see he wrote this back in the 70s, but I'm not sure that much has changed in terms of myths and ideas that people have in their heads about terrorists and terrorism incidents and what is true in actuality. So, one of the myths that he wanted to dispel is the idea that terrorism is some new phenomenon in the 20th century. Terrorism is by no means a 20th century phenomenon. There are examples of domestic terrorist groups on both sides of the political spectrum well into our country's history and well into, ancient history throughout the world. Another kind of myth that tends to get put out there is the idea that it's always some kind of a left wing or a revolutionary group. It's really very, very rarely the case that all terrorist incidents within a country come from one side of the political spectrum. There are examples of, especially when you think about domestic terrorism in this country, there are examples of people who have committed acts of terrorism that are on many different sides of the political perspective. Another myth that he talks about is the myth that people seem to think that terrorism always takes place when there's some kind of legitimate grievances, that amending these grievances will in some way work. It's very far from the case, according to Lacan. He talked about the fact that, sometimes the most repressive, unjust societies are also those with the least amount of terrorist activity. So it's not just the case that people who are the most oppressed, who have legitimate reasons to act out, are the ones committing the most acts of terrorism. He also talks about the fact that there's this perception that terrorists and terrorist organizations are idealists, that they have some ideological purpose, some kind of the idea that what they're doing on behalf of kind of the greater good for their purpose. He talks about in several of his essays the fact that terrorism also often involves sacrifices of humans, of human behaviors, kind of in the name of revolutionary goals. So the idea that there's this kind of greater purpose behind what people are doing isn't always the case. Not very often, some of the ideals that terrorist organizations talk about in terms of, justification, backing for their actions, don't really have a lot of support, don't really have a lot of people out there who would kind of align with their ideas. And there's this idea that terrorism is kind of a weapon of the poor, the oppressed of a country. And we know that, for the most part, that seems to be fairly far from the case, at least in terms of leaders of terrorist organizations. Most terrorist leaders that we know of come from fairly affluent backgrounds within their countries. It doesn't necessarily just happen to be a group of extremely, alienated, disadvantaged people that form into terrorist groups. It's not just a weapon of the disadvantaged or poor. So we're going to talk about domestic terrorism and differentiate it, and differentiate domestic terrorism from international terrorism. What I mean by domestic terrorism is acts that happen on U.S. soil. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're committed by people who are from the United States, but acts that happen within our domestic borders are things that you would call acts of domestic terrorism. So the recent kind of most legal definition of this, which we get from the Patriot Act, written into law a few years ago, a couple different things have to be in place for you to call something a domestic terrorist incident. First of all, there has to be illegal, intentional danger to life. Whether or not it actually is able to be successful or not isn't part of the law. It's whether or not you have intent to illegally and dangerously threaten American citizens. Another part of the definition is the fact that, again, getting behind the motivation, meaning you can only call something an incident of domestic terrorism if the motivation behind it seems to be guided by trying to influence the government, either by force or intimidation, to some greater end. So, some examples of types of domestic terrorism which we've had, sometimes very recent examples of it in recent years: acts of mass destruction, assassinations of political leaders, kidnapping of influential government members. And what we're talking about here, again, what makes it a domestic terrorism incident is that it's occurring for the most part within the USA. Doesn't mean that the people committing the act are United States citizens, but if it's happening on US soil, we call it domestic terrorism. So just to give you an idea of the actual language that's set forth in the USA Patriot Act a few years ago, they define acts of domestic terrorism as those which have a couple parts. The first part is that it involves acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state. Second part is they appear to be intended, either that they appear to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, or they intend to intimidate or coerce the policy of a government. And they also talk about the fact that acts of terrorism, like the things that go into this category, would be acts of mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. and things that occur within the United States. So, the Patriot Act has gotten very fairly specific over time about what is not categorized as an act of domestic terrorism, and it has to be very specific because the laws that we have enacted as a result of the Patriot Act to punish acts of domestic terrorism are much more serious than similar crimes committed for very different motivations and very different reasons. So, thinking back to some of the more famous issues of domestic terrorism in the past few years, the Oklahoma City bombings is probably not something that you all maybe have an actual recollection of when it happened. Happened in April, around this time, basically, in 1995. What happened in Oklahoma City is about 168 people were killed when a bomb in the federal building in Oklahoma City went off, destroyed not only the federal building but many other buildings in the surrounding area. And this is an example of a domestic terrorism incident where the people who committed the crime were actually, U.S. citizens, Americans. Timothy McVeigh and a man named Terry Nichols designed and planted the bomb, allegedly timing it on the same day as the Waco siege of the David Koresh compound. So essentially, what Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols alleged as their primary motivation behind committing this act is they're very upset at the way that the government handled the siege of the Waco compound, which was led by the kind of cultish leader David Koresh. Again, not probably something that some of you remember, but you can see how that's a domestic terrorist incident. They're committing an act, intentional violent act against not only American government workers but American citizens because they were upset about something that the government did, about something that the government did in their treatment of a group of people. The 9/11 attacks are obviously not something that I really need to explain to you guys. Series of coordinated plane hijackings. Total number of people killed from all the attack sites was about 3,000 people, 2,977 people. Again, committed by the people taking credit for the 9/11 attacks, Al Qaeda, committed for kind of ideological purposes. And I apologize for the end of the slide got a little bit cut off, but another kind of example of a very recent domestic terrorism incident, which I unfortunately had a lot of experience with, was the shooting in the Holocaust Memorial Museum a few years ago. So, for those of you who remember this happening a few years ago, a gentleman, an elderly man by the last name of von Brunn, who had ties to some neo Nazi organizations in the United States and had published several kind of anti Semitic pieces online, he entered the Holocaust Museum, which is right on the National Mall right by all the monuments and things and the Smithsonian's, entered the museum at about 1 p.m. In the summer of 2009 and shot the security guard who was opening the door to let him in. He actually ended up dying awaiting trial, and I actually was there. I was running. I was going out for a run around the National Mall with a friend of mine, and we had to get down, and we're a little bit too close for comfort to what happened at the Memorial Museum that day. But all of those are examples of domestic terrorist incidents because they happen on U.S. soil for ideological purposes. They check all of the boxes of what we're talking about here. Even though some of them were committed by Americans, some of them aren't, that's not really what makes it a domestic terrorist incident.